Hi, today I'd like to talk about macros in Clojure. Okay, so what are macros? Now, this is a bit difficult to explain, but I would say they are code that writes code. Let's go to our friend Google to see how they are explained. Okay. Says the compiler can be extended by user code. It doesn't really say much to me. Let's find out. Somewhere else. It may be that it's easier to explain macros with an example. I think it might make sense to talk a little bit about languages in general before I talk about macros, because I think every language actually has this concept of code which can make other code, but they might call it by different terms. In Java, you have a lot of systems that do code generation. So what they have is they look at some XML or they look at some Java. Maybe we can find an example of this somewhere. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of things that generate code in Java. So here's one: cglib, velocity, jbossc. Now, the reason why you might have code generation is because there's a lot of boilerplate code that you have when you're making something. And often when you look at code, you can see that there's code which does the application or business logic, and then there's all this like plumbing which is around that code. So, for example, opening and closing database connections and resources and things like that. So, code generation is used because it means that you just write the business logic, and then the rest of the code is generated by the system itself. Now, the big problem with code generation is that when you do that, you have to also often maintain the generated code. So you might make some generated code from like 10 lines of Java, but you end up having to maintain 100 and debug 100 lines of Java. And that maintenance can be a big problem. So this is what macros are like. Macros, they generate code for you just as they do in Java, but they don't create extra source files for you to maintain. Now, I don't know if that's a good or bad definition of macros, but maybe if I show an example, it could be more clear. So let's go into light table. Okay. So now we're in light table, we can open up a Clojure install repo. So it's just setting up light table. You can see it here, downloading some libraries or something. Okay, so let's check that it's working. Okay, 101, define see. Okay, so we can see that the instant report is working. Now, let's. So the first thing to see here is we've defined a function here, a normal function using defen. Now, let's try some logic here. Let's try if a equals 1. So then we can say if a equals 1, we can say then true, otherwise false. Okay, so we can say here if a equals 2, false. If a equals 0, false. If a equals 1, you can see it says true. Okay, now let's say we want to define if not. Oh, that's already defined. So we can say if isn't, we'll call it. If isn't a equals 1, okay, it doesn't exist. So we could say, okay, defen, okay, so if not expression, and then we could say then do A, otherwise do B. Okay. Every time I look at macros, I forget exactly how they work. It's just one of those things. They're a bit of a mind bender. So I need to practice as much as you do, probably. So okay. So if a equals 1, okay. So if a equals 0, true. So this seems to work. So it's like, okay. So that's good. If isn't is working, but A appears to work because let's see what's happening here. So we pass here to if isn't. We're passing these arguments. We're passing if A equals 1, true and false. So this gets the expressions in here. So it does if not expression, then do A, then return A, otherwise return B. Okay. Let's just check here. If isn't. So it appears to work. Now let's clear the console. Let's do something different. Let's say if A equals 1, print true. There, true. If A equals 1, print false. Otherwise, print false. Okay. Okay. Let's say true. Okay. If A equals 0, we can just always see here the value of A, by the way. So we say 1, if A is 1, it's true. Okay. Now, if A is 0, false. Okay, fine. So we say, so that works. But what if we want to say, well, if A isn't, now we have a problem, because now it's printing both true and false. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that when if isn't is called, it's a normal function. So here, if isn't, and then we pass in these things. We pass in this, a equals 0 here, and we pass in the result of calling this, and then the result of calling this. So the problem is before anything's even happened in if isn't, it evaluates all of these arguments, and that's the problem, and that's where we need macros. So what we actually want to do is we want to say for if isn't, we have to say how do we actually want it defined. We actually would want to say, like here we have if is like that. If isn't, however, we would want it defined like if not. So if not a equals not, let's see. Okay. Let's see what is the value of a. Okay, so here, if a is not 0, print true, it's not 0. So if we change if not a equals 1, now it's printing false. Okay, so that's how we want it to work. So what this means is we can't just call a normal method. We have to use the macro here instead. So now, so we want to produce something like this code, and we want to pass these in to a macro which should be defined with this name, and that should then have this as the resulting code. Does that make sense? I'm not sure, but okay. Let's see if we can make a macro which does that. So I can never remember how macros are written, but let's try this. Get macro. If isn't. Let's just try something like this. Now, with macros, you have something. So here's a macro which returns nil. Now you have to remember that macros get evaluated at compile time, not at runtime. So they write the code when the code is being read into the compiler, into the Clojure compiler. So let's Clojure with a J. You can always see what the results of a macro is by calling this macro expand. And you have to do this because you have to pass in the list. So nil. So now you can see here's the values of the macro. So let's pass in. We want to get code out, which is, so given these three inputs, we want to get code out of the macro that looks like something like this. So let's copy these. Def macro expression AB. So if it isn't, we maintenance. It returns nil. Now this is the code, the results of the macro expand is what will get compiled by the compiler, by the way. Confused? I am. You should be. It takes some time to understand this, a lot of trial and error. Okay, so let's try and return something here. Okay, so equals A0. That's good. So you return, so that's what. So if we pass in, so now if we call if isn't here, what does it actually return? Okay, this is actually going to return the result of A equals 0. Okay, see, so A is equal to 1. So we've got that, but we can see that here. So then what we do is we say, in the macro itself, we want to say if, now here's where it gets complicated. You have to quote the whole thing in the macro. So you say if expression then A else B. Okay, but this is not correct. You can see this is the code it generates here. So I think we want to say if here's where I get confused. So now let's go back to the documentation. Let's have a look. So we want to, what I'm trying to do is, in the macro, I'm trying to say, whatever's passed in here, expand it here. This thing, by the way, just means that all of this stuff will get copied in like as is. So you can see here the if is gone straight in. So let's have a look. Closure here, backtick. Oh, maybe it's like this. If A equals 0, then you can see here it's put it in A, otherwise B. Okay, so you can see this looks like this macro is correct now. So now when you do this, if isn't works. So if isn't A equals 1, print true. What was A? 1. Okay, so that's wrong because, hang on, is that correct? Here, okay. What we wanted to do was actually say not, if not A equals 1. So if not, so this should now produce false. If A equals 1, it should print true. If A is not equal to 1, okay, yeah. So this seems to be working now. So to summarize, def macro to make a macro, pass in the parameters here, use this to expand the code, to show what code you want to be in there, use this to replace, use this thing here to get so that this replaces whatever is in here. And then you can test the macro with this. There. If a equals 0, if a equals. So this is a code you actually want to insert. So that seems to work. Anyway, I hope that explains a little bit about how macros work in Clojure. There's still a lot I don't know, but I have used macros to good effect in my code because it means I can get rid of a lot of boilerplate code, and maybe I should have another episode where I show you some of the macros I've made and what the alternative would have been if I hadn't used macros. Okay. Anyway, I hope that was useful. That's all for today. Thanks. Bye.